welcome to this Egenis seminar. I'm really happy to welcome. I just had to run in, it's really confusing. Celso Neto, who is a new lecturer here, we're really excited to have him. Celso has studied in Brazil, he was born, and Germany, and finished his PhD in Calgary under Mark Jaroszewski. He then moved eastward to for Doolittle's lab. We had a sort of postdoc there, and has now, to our great delight, joined us here. Celso's research is often interested in sort of grabbing sort of things that philosophers of biology should have thought more about but haven't. Strikingly, things like lineages, strikingly things like how we integrate various bits of biological information, and notions of classification, which now he's bringing into thinking about the notion of biological race. And so today he's going to bring some, I'm guessing, some values in science literature into the discussion of the reality or otherwise of race. So here is Celso with the risk of biological race realism.
Thank you very much, Adrian. And I want to start just thanking everyone for coming, and actually just saying how pleased I am to be part of this department and part of Egenis. So I'm really honored and flattered by the opportunity to work here with you and contribute to this community. On that note, the view that the view called biological race realism is the view that human races exist, and they are biologically distinct populations. Of course, as is well known, this view has been rejected throughout the 20th century in several ways. In 1950s, we have UNESCO publishing a letter signed by several scientists denying the reality of biological races. Throughout decades, we have important and famous scientists like Richard Lewontin and Stephen Jay Gould also providing powerful criticisms against this idea. Nevertheless, in the last 20 years, we have a comeback, which can be traced to at least 3 different factors. So we had advancements in and the availability of DNA technology to the wider public. We have extremely successful studies in human migrations, and we also have the use of racial classifications in medicine. So factors like this leads us to a well-documented history of how the race science has made a return. And we have scientists defending the existence of a certain idea of biological race over and again. Some scientists more serious than others. We also have important philosophers doing actually serious work in philosophy of science to defend biological races. So for that reason, let's take those philosophical theories seriously. And today what I'm going to do is to analyze one of them, what I take to be the most sophisticated one. So this is the theory proposed by this nice guy on the slide, Crenshaw Spencer's. I will, say that his argument is unconvincing, but that's not the main takeaway of my talk. What I'm actually doing is analyzing his theory as a case study to discuss how metaphysics of race, so theories about the reality of those categories, interconnect with social, political, and moral values. The broader question here is how morality and social political values should influence or constrain our metaphysical activities. So before I continue, let me just make a disclaimer. There are many perhaps not many, but some metaphysical theories about race who are clearly related to social, political, moral values. Theories about the social construction of race. That's all and good, but the theories that I'm going to talk about today are theories that said that actually there is some biological grounding above and beyond possible social values that exist in some contexts. There are at least some contexts that in which we can say that biological races are biologically real. They have a biological grounding that is not immediately connected to the way that races might be socially constructed in other contexts. So I will come back to that in a moment. So here's the plan for the talk. First, I describe Spencer's theory. Then I shift the gears towards the discussion of social, political, moral values. After that, I connect both points, saying how biological race realism relates to values in a way that I think it's not explicitly recognized by Crenshaw Spencer. And that's the point. I want to review something that is not explicit because I want to review a certain question that has not been explored, namely how metaphysics is value-laden. Okay, so first, Spencer's. After a sip of water, we can start with Spencer's argument. And his argument starts with a linguistic analysis. So he likes philosophy of language. That's how he starts. And he starts talking about language use in the US. So in the US context, he will say that not always, but frequently, people will use racial terms in a way that it's stipulated by the government. It's stipulated by the OMB, which is the sector of the American government that regulates the American census. So OMB stipulates 5 races in America: Asian, American Indian, Black, Pacific Islander, and white. So every time people in America are applying for jobs, or people applying for jobs in America, they will have to fill a form. They will have to self-identify with one of those races. So in those kinds of contexts who are pervasive in the US, when you apply for a job, apply for a loan, apply for education, Spencer will say that people are using racial terms in a way that it's stipulated by the government. Now, the next premise of his argument is to say that those racial terms, as stipulated by the government, refer to something that population geneticists call human continental populations. So he uses several fancy philosophy of language tools to make this point. I'm not focusing on that today, but the idea is that for each of those 5 racial terms, we have a correspondent population whose ancestry can be traced back to specific continental origin. So for Asian, for the term Asian, for instance, there is a population of East Asians in the US. So for American Indian, we have Native Americans, so on and so forth. So racial terms in the US refer frequently to human continental populations. Now, by starting with those premises of language use, now we have to reformulate the very question of the reality of races. So are human races biologically real? Well, if we accept the Spencer's linguistic analysis, this is the question that human continental populations would be biologically real or not. So that's the correct way to rephrase the question about the reality of races. We have to talk about human continental populations in genetics. And Spencer has also a very fancy theory about what biological reality means, We will go back to that in a second, but for now, let's see what he means by that. What does it take for something to be biologically real? First, something has to be part of a well-ordered research program. So a human continental population has to be part of a good research program in order to be real. Moreover, these populations have to be useful and justified according to the epistemic standards of that very research program. So now I will navigate you through these two criteria and show how, according to Spencer, human continental populations, in other words, human races, would satisfy both criteria. Okay, well-ordered research program, what is that? It's any area of science or research program in science that has, first of all, well-motivated goals. So Spencer is interested in population genetics. So he will say, for instance, that it is fully legitimate for geneticists to study human genetic diversity. This is a legitimate goal. Another legitimate goal is trying to trace human migration patterns. A well-ordered research program also has to deliver. It has to produce theories, predictions, explanations in the context of empirical studies that can be replicated, that can be cross-checked. So population genetics, again, would be a center example, a paradigmatic case of a well-legitimate scientific enterprise. And Spencer is particularly interested here in a set of studies in population genetics. It's not so much in the whole field, but is in a set of research, empirical research on human genetic diversity. This is the research conducted by Noah Rosenberg and colleagues coming from Stanford University. So what happens in this research? Well, scientists collect samples across the world in multiple populations across the globe. And what they are collecting are these microsatellites, this set of genetic components that allegedly have no coding function at all. So using those elements, what the scientists want then is to classify the humans who have the sample, the blood sample, in terms of genetic similarity. So, of course, to do this genetic similarity analysis, the first thing you have to do is to choose an algorithm. And once you have an algorithm, you have to give the algorithm an input. Namely, you want to tell the algorithm how many clusters you want to get in your final analysis. In other words, you have to decide how many groups of genetic similar humans you want to get in the end of the day. So that explains in this figure, K equals 2, meaning lumping humans into two groups based on genetic similarity. K equals 3 means 3 groups, so on and so forth. The interesting feature of this study is that if scientists decide to group humans into 5 groups of genetic similar individuals, they will get roughly those 5 categories of human continental populations. So what matters the most here is that this would be a case of a legitimate study in population genetics. But moreover, in this type of study, those 5 racial categories, and the very category called human continental populations, those categories are useful and justified in those studies. Human continental populations are useful to generate hypotheses. That's the claim that Spencer is making. So scientists use those categories to create hypotheses, such as the following one. Human continental populations correspond to the K=5 genetic clusters. This hypothesis satisfies epistemic standards of the discipline of population genetics. It satisfies empirical accuracy and precision. And it's also useful to predict and explain certain phenomena. So if scientists collect my blood sample without knowing anything else about me, right, they will explain my origin. Reversely, if you fill one of those forms when you apply for a job or a loan in America, let's say you fill one of those forms, you say that your race is white. Scientists will predict with a very strong possibility of being right what type of genetic component you have. So there is usefulness and prediction there. So in the end of the day, this argument that Spencer is putting forward is a sort of parity of reasoning argument. He's saying, look, so far, when people discuss whether biological races exist or not, they are establishing a really high bar for the existence of biological races. They're expecting that for something to be a biological race, it has to explain a lot of features of the human beings, a lot of the phenotypic traits of humans. It has to explain behavior. It has to be central to science. Of course, no notion of biological race would satisfy all those demands. But in science, and that's what Spencer is arguing, in science, when scientists coin certain categories, use certain classifications, and when they argue that something is real, they don't have those high demands in terms of those categories. So what Spencer says is that race is real in a deflationary way, in a way that it's like saying that monophyletic groups are real, or that a particular gene is real, or that the hypothalamus is real. It's like a useful category that exists and plays a particular role in a research project. So, takeaway of his view, reality of races is based on epistemic utility. It's based on the categories being useful in theories, predictions, and explanations, right? This is a type of local realism. He's talking about how people in America are talking about race. What is the reference of those terms in America? Doesn't mean that the same would apply to the UK. Finally, you cannot say that there is races in this view, right? Like, not explicitly at least. Like, and he's very adamant. He's a serious scholar who in every paper writes down that there is no defense, there is no traction to racist ideas. Okay, enough for Spencer. Now let's talk about values in science. So the literature on values in science is gigantic, of course. Today I'm talking about the notion of risk. That's my focus, and how risk relates to values. So one idea of risk is called epistemic risk. There is one type of risk. So this is the possibility of scientists being mistaken, when they are engaging in their knowledge-producing activities. Here is hydroxychloroquine. Imagine that scientists are investigating whether this drug is efficacious against COVID-19. One way that scientists could be mistaken in their research is, for example, if they mislabel their data sample. Something simple like that. That's a mistake that might lead to wrong results later on. As indicated, this category of epistemic risk is pretty broad, right? Any mistake during science, like that's really broad. So let's narrow it down. So a subtype would be inductive risk. That's a particular type of mistake that scientists can make when they're just about to accept or reject a particular hypothesis. So think again about hydroxychloroquine. That's my favorite example. So one type of mistake scientists can do is, of course, wrongly conclude that hydroxychloroquine is efficacious. And it's very clear that several bad consequences can come out of that. People ingesting hydroxychloroquine, getting the side effects, not getting the benefits. Another type of mistake, though, would be wrongly concluding against the efficacy of the drug, in case the drug is actually efficacious. If this would happen, people would be prevented from actually getting a very ready available cure for their for COVID-19, and governments and industry would spend millions, right, searching for a better drug when there is one already available. So by talking about these possible harmful consequences, what I want to point attention to is how inductive risk invites values into science. So scientists, before accepting or rejecting a hypothesis, in ideal circumstances, they have to ask the question how much evidence they actually need before accepting or rejecting a hypothesis. There is no clear answer for that since they are engaging in an inductive activity. And in an ideal scenario, to answer this question about how much evidence is needed, one needs to consider the consequences of false positives and false negatives. So, and which consequences one should avoid the most. So this is a value-laden judgment. Therefore, values come into science. Roughly speaking, everything else being equal, right? If there are severe consequences of my possible mistakes, I want to hide to make the standards of evidence really high, so I want to minimize the possibility that I'm wrong. So in this decision, again, value-laden. Okay, now another type of risk is, again, a broader one. It's ethical risk. There's the possibility of harms that can happen to anyone, either during the process of knowledge production or the release of its results. And this is regardless of how good the actual scientific practice is. Regardless of possible mistakes of scientists, perhaps they can do an infallible activity. There might still be harms. Hydroxychloroquine again. Imagine that during the clinical trials, scientists simply don't have a good, don't provide a good informed consensus to the subjects. There is lack of consent. There is harm to the autonomy of the patients. So this type of risk also invites values into science. Very obviously, scientists have to consider how they can do research at all in an ethically responsible way, right? There are ethical committees that will oversee this ethical responsibility, that will put pressure on scientists to design protocols, to redesign experiments, to change methodologies, and in the end of the day, to even stop that research. There are certain researches that cannot be done for ethical reasons. Simple like that. So this is just an overview. It's of course not new to you. I don't expect that to be new to you. So the takeaway here is just a reminder that risks are inviting the influence of social, political, and moral values in science in different ways, such as requiring further evidence for hypotheses, for claims, but also by revising data methodologies, experimental designs, etc. With this overview done, let's bring those two sections together. Let's talk about risk and biological race realism after my sip of water. The question here, and I'm really interested in what you think about this, because this is an ongoing project, is how is risk and therefore values, how are they present in Spencer's arguments? How are they connected to biological race realism? And actually, before I move forward, just let me return to a point that I said in the beginning of the talk. Let me return to the slide. There are many theories of race reality, such as social constructivism, who will say, obviously, risk is related to our theories. We want to, in fact, there are theories who define race in ways to really fight against several ethical risks. That's what those theories are motivated by. But that's not what Spencer's biological race realism is motivated by. Neither other alternatives, other ways to argue for biological race realism. The whole strategy of biological race realism in the recent years is precisely to say that in particular contexts of science, questions about risk don't come in. So do they come? Don't they come? That's the question. And to answer this question, we can at least engage in two levels of analysis, and that's what I'm going to do. One level of analysis, a more obvious one and perhaps less interesting, is to think about how the empirical studies that Spencer is relying on, how those studies are affected by risk, and therefore how indirectly biological race realism depends on those risks as well. Perhaps a more interesting conversation is whether Spencer's metaphysical tools are bringing risk in a way that goes above and beyond the empirical studies that he discusses. So let's navigate through these two levels of analysis. Let me remind you, level one, let's talk about the empirical studies done by Rosenberg and colleagues. Those studies show that if you divide human diversity based on microsatellites into 5 groups, you get the human continental populations. Of course, there are epistemic risks involved in this type of study, right? For example, error in data collection, right? There is a possibility of error in redundancy when collecting data. So this is one type of risk. More interesting, inductive risk is a really important issue in this type of study because scientists, they are really well aware of the harmful consequences that those studies could have. So they're really scared of the possibility of false positives and false negatives here. So, and therefore, they will assume values. They don't want to promote racism. They don't want to promote those things, therefore they better gather a lot of evidence for those claims. So human continental populations correspond to K equals 5 genetic clusters. This is a conclusion that can be a false positive or a false negative. Therefore, we must consider values. There are ethical risks also involved in this, related to this type of study, and that's what I want to focus more now. So bear with me for a few minutes. Because there has been a lot of interesting studies in the last 10 years related to how kids learn genetics in school. And those studies have been showing a strong association between racist beliefs among children and the learning of genetic diseases in terms of racial terms. So in other words, if students learn about the incidence of genetic diseases by referring to things like, oh, African Americans have this propensity of having this type of disorder. If you learn that in terms of genetic groupings, students will tend to develop racist beliefs. So that's a pretty robust result. Well, let me turn back here just to mention that how this relates to Rosenberg at all. Well, they are aware of those studies. And for this, precisely for this reason, they have disclaimers in their papers saying that what they are talking about is not about race. So those scientists are saying nothing that we say here is about race. We are talking about human continental populations. So don't try to think that we are promoting racist beliefs. But of course, the ethical risk is once we have those results published, it sounds like legitimate to teach kids, to teach genetics in terms of those genetic differences. So the conclusion for this first level of analysis is just to repeat what I said about hydroxychloroquine. So empirical studies implicitly involve social, political, and moral judgments in many, many different ways. Furthermore, biological race realism, as proposed by Spencer, is very much predicated on those particular empirical studies. Biological race realism is predicted on how those studies are done, what are the results of the study, what are the types of inferences and explanations that can come out of those studies. So it's really hard to dissociate the values that can come in to those studies from biological race realism. So it sounds that at least indirectly, biological race realism is committed to indirectly to certain values. So it's not risk-free. But at this point, of course, you can say, well, that's like sort of weak because then like many works in metaphysics of science who are based on empirical studies will also be value-laden. Well, I mean, that's true. They would be very value-laden. The question is how metaphysical work on sensible topics, how being value-laden should matter, right? Because if my metaphysics of lineages, okay, might be value-laden, but who cares, right? Not sure about the social consequences of that. Race, I think, is a different matter. But let's move to the second level of analysis to end this discussion. So here, let me start by pointing out something very interesting. As I said, Spencer is serious, and Spencer has pointed out in the last years that he's worried. He's worried about possible consequences of his view, how people can understand his view, and harms that can be followed from a philosopher claiming that races are biologically real. So he mentions two harms. One is two problems. One is if politically right-winged people misuse his research. This is one worry. But the other worry that is more prominent is precisely the one about those educational research studies that I mentioned before. So he says, I'm worried about the educational research that shows learning about human genetic differences in racial terms increases racist attitudes among the learners. So he's worried about that. In his most recent papers, he actually goes about addressing this worry. And the way that he's addressing this worry is to say that there is no empirical evidence yet about the correlation between my metaphysics, me publishing papers on biological race realism, and the association, the result of kids being taught about genetics in this way and leading to racist beliefs. So that's his answer for now. It's very brief, and then we can discuss about that. I'm less interested in his research, but what's going on. He's saying, well, it's for now, it's better to improve genetic education than suppress my philosophy of race. What's interesting in this research is that he's implicitly admitting that he would consider stopping doing the research. So if there were sufficient evidence, he could consider stopping doing the research because the research is harmful. So, in other words, Spencer is recognizing implicitly that there is ethical risk in doing metaphysics of race. He's accepting that there are certain value judgments that we share, such as we should stop racism. And those value judgments might lead us to stop doing certain types of research, like the research that he does. What I want to claim is that I'm not sure this is the whole story when we talk about values and the relationship with biological race realism. Because for one thing, it seems that there are also epistemic risks in Spencer's theory. So Spencer can be mistaken about things during his theorizing. And if he can be mistaken about those things can lead to harmful consequences. So perhaps his claim that races are biologically real are based on certain mistakes that he is making. And if that's the case, he probably wants to minimize those mistakes because he doesn't want to open the door for harms. So some ways he could be wrong in his theorizing. He can be misled by genetic results. So one interesting thing here to notice is how he's using research from scientists who are saying, look, I'm talking about these populations. They are not race. And he's saying, well, you were talking about race. Because that's how Americans use race on their daily lives. So there is room for like being misled here and misinterpretation. There's also this other interesting thing going on, which is like he's zooming in this particular types of studies and saying this is really representative of population genetics. There is no argument for that. So there might be misinterpretation of the population genetics as a research program. Perhaps the research program is not as unified as he thinks it is. There might also be some mistakes in his own theory about what is biologically reality. So remember his parity argument. He wants to say that something is biologically real in a way that makes sense, in a way that captures what scientists actually go about, like classifying things. Like something like a particular type of gene is real because it's useful, and that's all that scientists are caring about. So this type of theory might be either too inclusive or too narrow. So these are possible mistakes. So why is it important to think about those possible mistakes? Here's a hypothetical case. Let's imagine that actually in 10 years from now, there is those studies that I mentioned about. Let's imagine that they show an indisputable link between biological race realism and the promotion of racist beliefs. At least in a few contexts, let's say in certain educational practices, let's say in certain types of colleges in the US, if people learn in this way, they will develop racist beliefs. Just a few contexts. Of course, it's always available for us to change the way we teach and to invoke educational practices to try to prevent kids from developing racist beliefs. Perhaps there might still be good reasons to keep researching and defending that races are biologically real. Perhaps in the future, we can have these human continental populations helping medicine in new ways. So just imagine this case. This is a sort of tricky case, right? Like, because there is an indisputable link, but perhaps biological race realism might be interesting as well. So I don't want to assume what Spencer would do in this case. I know what I would do, but I don't know what he would do. I don't want to assume that. Let's imagine that he will still be sticking to his theory. He will be sticking to his theory, but I'm pretty sure he would recognize the epistemic risk involved, because he probably doesn't want to defend a theory that is false, that will lead to the promotion of races because of his mistakes, right? That's hard. Like your mistake leading to such a result. So I think that he probably would be trying to avoid mistakes as much as possible. So, and if he's trying to avoid mistakes as much as possible, he better have very good reasons for the reality of races. Those reasons should be sufficiently clear, unambiguous, and convincing. So, what are those reasons? So, let's go back to his reasons. Remember, the reality of races is based on epistemic utility. Concepts that are useful to generate hypotheses, predictions, etc. In his most recent paper, Spencer is just focusing on one example. He thinks that that's enough. The example is that we have a hypothesis like this one, right? Human continental populations correspond to K equals 5 genetic clusters. This is a hypothesis that is legitimate, right? And it might lead to some predictions and explanations for Noah Rosenberg and his group at Stanford. So is there a clear, unambiguous, sufficient reason to claim that biological races are useful in a well-ordered research program and therefore they're real? Well, I don't think it is. There are several problems. One is the type of example that he's using is of course, in a sense, self-referential, right? is to say that, look, this category here in science is useful because then scientists can use it to search the reference to see if that category has some correspondence to reality, right? So if that's the case, any operational term in a good scientific practice would count as something real. I'm not sure that scientists want to agree with that. Another problem, and I already mentioned this by passing, is this association between the set of studies done by Rosenberg and population genetics as a whole, right? One thing is to say that we have these categories over here that are useful across studies in this field of population genetics. Perhaps if you show to me that there is such a category that's useful, I'd be more convinced that scientists need that category. Another thing is to talk about a particular set of studies and to claim that those categories are really necessary to generate the types of predictions and explanations that are generated. For example, the predictions about my geographical origin, right? It's not clear that we really need those categories in order to come up with these predictions. So these are just two simple issues that put into question the clarity, the unambiguous character of those reasons for the reality of race. So to wrap it up, remember, this is all about the parity of reasoning argument in the end of the day. So Spencer wants to say that races are real in the same way that other kind of marginal categories in science are real as well. Even though I don't think that monophyletic groups are actually marginal, so that's a bit baffling, but perhaps this type of gene is. I think one way to put my argument here, and that's actually more than an argument, what I'm doing is thinking about a research project, a research agenda. So I really appreciate your feedback on that. So what seems to me that is really missing here from Spencer's picture is that even taking for granted those categories that he's talking about as real, it seems that risk and values involved in those categories are just significantly different. Like the risk and values involved when scientists claim that a certain group in the tree of life is a monophyletic tree, that risks and values involved in this research just seem very different from research on race. And that's what I want to highlight here. So to conclude, Spencer's argument, he recognized ethical risks, but he doesn't recognize epistemic ones. So that's important. And once we recognize those risks, for me, it becomes clear that his reasons for the reality of race are not convincing, in particular because we are dealing with a high-stakes situation in which certain beliefs can lead to racist attitudes. So overall conclusion, biological race realism is influenced by social, political, moral values. Possible harmful consequences of this view require very clear and sufficient evidence, which I'm not sure he provides. So, as I said, this is what I'm trying to think here is I'm trying to do an exercise of how philosophical and in particular metaphysical work on theories of classification, on natural kinds, on reality, how those arguments and theories should be subject to moral and political values. So we can ask several questions, such as, is there something analogous to inductive risk happening in philosophical arguments? Are philosophers subject to other sources of risk and value? And how morality and social political values should influence or constrain our metaphysical activities? Thank you very much.